The village of St. Mary Mead had enjoyed an exceptionally pleasant spring, and nowhere was this more evident than in the gardens that lined the high street like jewels on a dowager's necklace. Each cottage seemed to compete with its neighbor in displays of wisteria, climbing roses, and cheerful daffodils that nodded in the gentle breeze. But it was the herb garden belonging to Mrs. Celia Worthington that had become the talk of the village that particular May. Mrs. Worthington, a widow of some 5 years and a relative newcomer to St. Mary Mead, having arrived only 3 years prior, had transformed the side garden of Rosemary Cottage into what the local horticultural society had dubbed a masterpiece of medicinal and culinary cultivation. Lavender hedges formed neat boundaries around raised beds of thyme, sage, and basil, and foxgloves stood like purple sentinels at the corners, while chamomile created soft, fragrant pathways between the sections. It was this very garden that served as the setting for the village's annual spring charity tea on the 3rd Saturday in May. The event, traditionally held to raise funds for the church roof, which was in a perpetual state of requiring repair, drew nearly every resident of note in St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple had arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as was proper, wearing her best dove-grey dress and carrying a small contribution of seed cakes she had baked that morning. She found her usual circle of friends already assembled near the refreshment table. Miss Hartnell, forever in tweeds despite the mild weather. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose imposing figure and even more imposing opinions dominated most village gatherings. And the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who wore the perpetually anxious expression of one who has organized such events too many times. "Jane, dear, do try the cucumber sandwiches," Mrs. Clement urged, her voice carrying the slight tremor of nervous exhaustion. Mrs. Worthington insisted on using her own herbs, dill, I believe, and some sort of cream cheese mixture. Quite innovative. Miss Marple accepted a sandwich with her characteristic gentle smile, noting with the practiced eye of decades of village observation that Mrs. Clement's hands trembled slightly as she held the plate. The vicar's wife had been looking rather strained of late, though whether from the usual pressures of parish duties or something more particular, Miss Marple had not yet determined. The garden itself was indeed lovely. Crowded now with perhaps 40 villagers in their spring finest, the ladies in floral prints and the gentlemen in their somewhat outdated blazers. Long tables draped in white linen held an impressive array of cakes, scones, and sandwiches. At the far end, near the magnificent rosemary bushes that gave the cottage its name, Mrs. Worthington herself presided over a silver tea service, her elegant figure clad in a dress of pale green that complemented her dark hair and striking features. "She does put on airs, doesn't she?" Miss Hartnell observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. "All this fuss over herbs. My mother grew herbs for 50 years and never felt the need to give tours of her garden." Now, Mrs. Price Ridley interjected, though her tone suggested agreement rather than reproof. "We must be charitable. Miss Worthington has been most generous in hosting this event, though I do wonder about a woman of her age. What is she, 40, living alone in such a large cottage? Most irregular." Miss Marple said nothing, but she had indeed observed Mrs. Worthington with some interest over the past months. The widow was handsome rather than pretty, with an air of sophistication that seemed slightly out of place in St. Mary Mead's rustic charm. She had money, clearly. The cottage had been extensively renovated, and her clothes bore the unmistakable mark of London shops. Yet there was something about her, a watchfulness in her dark eyes, a certain tension in her gracious smiles that suggested a woman perpetually on guard. "I understand her husband was in imports," Mrs. Clement offered quietly. "Tea from India. He died rather suddenly. Heart trouble, I believe." "Convenient," Miss Hartnell muttered, then colored slightly. "Oh dear, that did sound dreadful, didn't it? I simply meant that she seems to have been left very comfortably situated." At that moment, a small disturbance rippled through the gathering. Dr. Haydock, the village physician and one of Miss Marple's oldest friends, had arrived with his guest from London, a Mr. Anthony Prescott. The latter was a striking man in his early 40s, tall and fair-haired, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being noticed. He wore a beautifully tailored suit that made every other gentleman present look decidedly provincial. What caused the stir, however, was not Mr. Prescott's appearance, but rather the reaction of their hostess. Mrs. Worthington, in the act of pouring tea for the elderly Colonel Melchett, and had frozen mid-pour, her face draining of all colour. The teapot wavered dangerously in her hand, and for a moment it seemed she might drop it entirely. Dr. Haydock, observing this, hurried forward. "My dear Mrs. Worthington, are you quite well? The heat, perhaps?" She recovered herself with visible effort, setting down the teapot with a hand that trembled only slightly. "Forgive me, Doctor. A momentary dizziness. I'm quite recovered." But her eyes remained fixed on Mr. Prescott with an expression that Miss Marple, watching from her vantage point near the cucumber sandwiches, could only characterize as profound shock mixed with something darker, fear, perhaps, or recognition of a most unwelcome sort. Mr. Prescott, for his part, exhibited his own moment of startlement before his features arranged themselves into an expression of polite interest. He approached Mrs. Worthington with Dr. Haydock, who was performing introductions with the cheerful obliviousness of one who has noticed nothing amiss. "Mrs. Worthington, may I present my old friend from my university days, Anthony Prescott. He's come down from London for a few days of country air and relaxation. Prescott, this is our hostess, Mrs. Celia Worthington." "How do you do?" Mr. Prescott said smoothly, extending his hand. His voice was cultured, pleasant. "What a magnificent garden. You must be very proud." Mrs. Worthington took his hand briefly. Miss Marple noted that it was the briefest of contacts and murmured something conventional. But the tension in her shoulders, the rigid set of her spine, spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to read such signs. "Have we met before, Mrs. Worthington?" Mr. Prescott asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "You seem familiar somehow." "I think not, Mr. Prescott," she replied, her voice regaining some of its usual composure. "I have rather a common face, I'm afraid. People often think they recognize me." This was so patently untrue. Mrs. Worthington's striking features were anything but common, that several people exchanged glances. Miss Marple took a delicate bite of her cucumber sandwich and listened with great attention. The moment passed. Mrs. Worthington excused herself to attend to other guests, and Mr. Prescott allowed Dr. Haydock to lead him toward the refreshment table. But Miss Marple observed that throughout the remainder of the tea, both Mrs. Worthington and Mr. Prescott maintained a careful awareness of each other's locations, like two chess players tracking pieces on a board. The afternoon proceeded pleasantly enough. Colonel Melchett held forth on the subject of the railway schedule with his usual bombast. Young Dennis Clement, the vicar's nephew visiting from London, entertained a group of younger villagers with stories of the theatre. Mrs. Hargreaves, the village gossip whose cottage adjoined Rosemary Cottage, could be heard complaining about the noise from Mrs. Worthington's late-night activities, clattering about in that kitchen at all hours, most inconsiderate. Miss Marple circulated slowly, exchanging pleasantries, observing. She noted that Mr. Prescott, after his initial encounter with Mrs. Worthington, spent much of his time in conversation with Colonel Melchett and the vicar Mr. Clement, discussing London clubs and shared acquaintances. Yet his gaze drifted regularly toward their hostess, and Mrs. Worthington, for all her gracious hosting, had acquired a brittleness, a too bright quality to her smiles. When young Dennis Clement approached her, he was a handsome lad of 25, and there had been village speculation about his attentiveness to the widow. She seemed almost to flinch before recovering herself. It was nearly 5 o'clock when Miss Marple, seeking a moment's quiet, wandered toward the far end of the garden where the foxgloves grew in profusion. The crowd had begun to thin as guests departed, though a dedicated core remained, unwilling to conclude such a pleasant afternoon. She was examining a particularly fine specimen of Digitalis purpurea when she heard voices from the other side of the hedge. Mrs. Worthington's voice, low and urgent, and a man's voice in response. Mr. Prescott's voice. Absolutely insist that you leave tomorrow, Mrs. Worthington was saying, her careful accent slipping slightly to reveal hints of something less refined beneath. Your presence here is intolerable. My dear Celia, or should I say Cecily, I'm a guest of Dr. Haydock. I can hardly depart without explanation. Then invent one. You're skilled at invention, as I recall. A pause. When Mr. Prescott spoke again, his tone had hardened. I had no idea you'd buried yourself in this provincial backwater. Quite the transformation you've managed. The lady of the manor, the charitable widow. Very convincing. I'm a widow, as you well know. And I've made a respectable life here. I'll thank you not to interfere with it. Respectable. Yes, I suppose that's one word for it. His laugh was unpleasant. Tell me, does anyone here know about? That is none of your concern. That life is finished. I'm someone else now. People are never truly someone else, my dear. They simply wear better costumes. Miss Marple, rooted to her spot by the foxgloves, heard the unmistakable sound of feet on the gravel path. Mrs. Worthington departing rapidly. A moment later, Mr. Prescott emerged from behind the hedge, nearly colliding with Miss Marple. "Oh, I beg your pardon, madam," he said, recovering his smooth manner with impressive speed. "I was admiring the herbs, quite the collection." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied with her gentle smile. "Mrs. Worthington is very knowledgeable. Foxglove, for instance. Such a lovely flower, though of course one must be careful. Digitalis, you know. Quite poisonous in the wrong hands, though a blessing in the right ones. My dear nephew Raymond always says that the same thing can be either medicine or murder, depending on the dose and the intention." Mr. Prescott's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained fixed. "How philosophical. Good day, madam." He strode away toward the house, and Miss Marple remained among the foxgloves, her mind working with the methodical precision of a lifetime spent observing human nature. There was history between Mrs. Worthington and Mr. Prescott, history of a sort that required concealment, and in Miss Marple's experience, things that required concealment tended eventually to require considerably more. She was making her way back toward the main gathering when a scream pierced the pleasant afternoon air, and it came from the kitchen of Rosemary Cottage, and it was Mrs. Hargreaves, the neighbor, who had apparently stepped inside to offer assistance with the washing up. Miss Marple, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her years, arrived at the kitchen door simultaneously with Dr. Haydock, Colonel Melchett, and several other guests. Mrs. Hargreaves stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, her face gray with shock. Beyond her, visible in the afternoon light that streamed through the kitchen window, lay Mrs. Celia Worthington, collapsed on the tiled floor beside her work table. A teacup lay shattered beside her, its contents, some sort of herbal tea by the smell, spreading in a dark pool across the tiles. Dr. Haydock pushed past Mrs. Hargreaves and knelt beside the fallen woman, his fingers seeking a pulse at her throat. The garden had gone utterly silent, 40 people frozen in a tableau of shock. After a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, Dr. Haydock looked up, his face grim. "She's dead," he said quietly. "Someone fetch the police, and no one is to leave the premises." The first person to break the frozen silence was Colonel Melchett, who stepped forward with the instinctive authority of a man accustomed to command. "Dr. Haydock, are you quite certain? Perhaps she's merely fainted. The shock of Mr. Prescott's arrival seemed to affect her considerably." Dr. Haydock remained kneeling beside the body, his expression grave. "I'm afraid there's no doubt, Colonel. She's gone." He bent closer, sniffing carefully at the spilled tea, then examining Mrs. Worthington's lips and the peculiar bluish tinge that had begun to appear around them. Now, this doesn't look like a natural death to me. We'll need Inspector Slack from Much Benham immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests, who had begun to crowd around the kitchen door. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice rose above the murmurs. "Murder? Surely you're not suggesting murder, Doctor. In St. Mary Mead? Preposterous." But Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, had already noted several telling details. The position of the body suggested Mrs. Worthington had been standing at the work table when she collapsed. An open book lay beside a mortar and pestle, a herbal remedy book, by the looks of it, open to a page about digestive tonics. Several fresh herbs were scattered across the wooden surface: peppermint, chamomile, and something else that Miss Marple's sharp eyes identified as monkshood, in that deadly member of the aconite family. Most concerning of all was the expression frozen on the dead woman's face, not peaceful or merely surprised, but contorted in what appeared to have been sudden, severe distress. "Everyone must remain exactly where they are," Colonel Melchett announced, having assumed the role of temporary authority. "Dr. Haydock, I'll telephone the police from the hall. The rest of you please return to the garden, but do not, under any circumstances, leave the premises." The crowd shuffled backward reluctantly, no one wanting to miss any detail of this extraordinary development. Miss Hartnell clutched Miss Marple's arm, her face pale beneath her sensible hat. "Jane, this is dreadful. Simply dreadful. Who would want to harm Mrs. Worthington? She was so generous, hosting this tea, opening her lovely garden." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, gently guiding her friend back toward the garden chairs. "Though one never truly knows what lies beneath the surface of even the calmest waters. That business with Mr. Prescott, for instance. Most peculiar." Mrs. Clement had begun to weep quietly. Whether from shock or the ruin of her charity event, it was difficult to say. Young Dennis Clement stood beside his aunt, his handsome face stricken. "I can't believe it," he kept repeating. "I simply can't believe it. She was so full of life, so vibrant. Just yesterday we were discussing her plans for expanding the garden." His words were interrupted by a commotion near the garden gate. Mr. Anthony Prescott was attempting to leave, his face set in lines of determination, but found his way blocked by the substantial form of Mrs. Price Ridley, and who had planted herself before the exit with the immovability of a medieval fortress. "The Colonel said no one is to leave," she declared, her prominent bosom heaving with indignation and perhaps a touch of excitement at being involved in such dramatic proceedings. "That includes London visitors who arrive unexpectedly and cause their hostesses to collapse from shock." Mr. Prescott's urbane manner had developed distinct cracks. "Madame, I assure you I had nothing to do with this tragedy. I barely knew Mrs. Worthington. Dr. Haydock can vouch for me. I've been in his company all afternoon." "Except when you disappeared behind the hedge for that private conversation," Miss Hartnell interjected sharply. She had recovered from her initial shock and was now fairly trembling with the thrill of having insider information. "I saw you slip away together, and when you returned, Mrs. Worthington looked positively shattered." All eyes turned to Mr. Prescott, who straightened his shoulders defensively. "We had a brief conversation, yes. She was an acquaintance from London. I only just recognized her. We exchanged a few words about mutual friends, nothing more. If she was upset, I certainly didn't notice." "You called her Cecily," Miss Marple said quietly from her garden chair, her knitting needles moving with steady rhythm. She had produced her knitting from somewhere about her person, as she always did in moments of stress or deep thought. "I couldn't help but overhear as I was examining the foxgloves. You called her Cecily, though she introduced herself as Celia. And you suggested she had transformed herself, that she was playing a role. Those were your words. I believe people are never truly someone else. They simply wear better costumes." The silence that followed this observation was profound. Mr. Prescott's face had gone quite white, then flushed an unbecoming red. You were eavesdropping?" Merely appreciating the flora, Mr. Prescott. One can hardly help what one overhears in a garden. Voices carry so, especially when raised in agitation. Dr. Haydock had emerged from the cottage, his expression troubled. The police are on their way. Inspector Slack and his men should arrive within the half-hour. He glanced around at the assembled villagers, his gaze lingering on Mr. Prescott. Anthony, perhaps you'd better tell me exactly what your connection was to Mrs. Worthington. The police will certainly ask. Before Mr. Prescott could respond, another voice cut through the tension, that of Mrs. Hargreaves, the neighbor, who had been sitting in stunned silence since discovering the body. She was afraid, she said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of revelation. These past 2 weeks, Mrs. Worthington was afraid of something. I heard her on the telephone late at night, arguing with someone, and twice I saw her standing at her bedroom window at 3 a.m, just standing there in the dark, watching the street as if she expected someone. Mrs. Hargreaves's declaration sent a fresh wave of speculation through the assembled guests. Miss Marple observed how quickly people shifted positions, unconsciously forming small clusters based on social allegiance and curiosity. The vicar, Mr. Clement, moved protectively toward his wife, while Colonel Melchett drew closer to Dr. Haydock, the two men conferring in low tones. Young Dennis Clement stood apart, his face a study in conflicting emotions that Miss Marple found most interesting. "Afraid of what, precisely?" Miss Hartnell demanded, her voice sharp with the eagerness of one who sensed a developing story. "Did she mention any names during these telephone conversations?" Mrs. Hargreaves twisted her handkerchief between her fingers, clearly torn between the desire to be helpful and the uncomfortable position of admitting she had been, in essence, spying on her neighbor. "I couldn't hear distinct words, you understand. The walls between our cottages are quite thick. But the tone was unmistakable, angry one moment, pleading the next, and once, about 10 days ago, I distinctly heard her say, 'You'll ruin everything I've built here.' That was very clear. How convenient that you happened to overhear so much," Mr. Prescott observed dryly, having somewhat recovered his composure. "One might almost think you made a habit of listening at walls." Mrs. Hargreaves drew herself up with offended dignity. "I'm not in the habit of eavesdropping, Mr. Prescott, but when one's neighbor keeps such irregular hours, clattering about at all times of night, one can hardly avoid noticing. And I wasn't the only one who observed Mrs. Worthington's changed behavior recently." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she absorbed this information. The bugle was indeed a reliable source of postal intelligence, if one could call it that. The village post mistress had an unfortunate but undeniable tendency to notice the destination and frequency of her customers' correspondence. "Perhaps," ventured Mrs. Clement, her tears now dried, "Mrs. Worthington was dealing with legal matters. Estates can be so complicated, and she was a widow managing her own affairs. The letters might have been to solicitors." "At 3 a.m? Mrs. Price Ridley interjected skeptically. "One doesn't conduct legal business at such hours, unless the business is of a most irregular nature." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, drawing attention back to practical matters. "Speculation aside, what we know with certainty is that Mrs. Worthington has died under suspicious circumstances. My, that tea she was drinking." He paused, glancing toward the cottage where the body still lay. It had a peculiar odor, sweet, almost honey-like, but with something else underneath, and the symptoms suggested by her appearance, the rapidity of death, the cyanosis. Well, I'm no expert in toxicology, but certain plant poisons come to mind. "Her own herbs," Miss Hartnell breathed, horrified fascination evident in her voice. "You think she was poisoned by something from her own garden?" "That table was covered with fresh cuttings," Miss Marple observed mildly, her eyes on her knitting. "I noticed when we were all crowded at the door. Monkshood was among them, a most dangerous plant, aconite. My nephew Raymond's medical books describe it as one of the swiftest-acting vegetable poisons. The symptoms appear within minutes. Burning sensations, numbness, difficulty breathing, cardiac arrest. Quite dreadful, really, though the plant itself is undeniably beautiful. Everyone turned to stare at Miss Marple, who continued knitting placidly as though she had merely commented on the weather. Young Dennis Clement's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. But Mrs. Worthington was an expert. She would never have mistaken monkshood for a culinary herb. She gave lectures on plant identification to the Horticultural Society. This must have been an accident, surely. Perhaps she was preparing something for the garden and somehow contaminated the teacup. Or someone else contaminated it, Mr. Prescott said flatly. Let us not dance around the obvious. If Dr. Haydock suspects poisoning and Miss Marple— He nodded tersely in her direction. Nick Dace has conveniently identified a deadly plant present at the scene. Then we're speaking of murder, are we not? And in that case, we must ask ourselves who had access to that kitchen, who had knowledge of toxic plants, and who had reason to wish Mrs. Worthington dead. We all had access, the vicar said quietly, his gentle face troubled. The kitchen door has been open all afternoon. Any of us could have slipped inside while Mrs. Worthington was occupied with guests. As for knowledge of plants, well, she'd been quite generous in sharing her expertise. Half the village has attended her herbal workshops. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Though there is a considerable difference between knowing that monkshood is poisonous and knowing precisely how to extract and administer a fatal dose. But that requires rather more specialized knowledge, wouldn't you say? The sort of knowledge one might acquire through medical training, perhaps, or pharmaceutical work, or— She paused delicately. Previous experience with such matters. The implication hung in the air like morning mist. Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably, though surely no one suspected the village physician. Yet his profession did grant him expert knowledge of poisons, and Mr. Prescott, whatever his connection to the deceased, had arrived from London with suspicious timing. Even young Dennis, who had been so attentive to Mrs. Worthington, might have possessed motives yet unknown. The sound of a motor car on the lane announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, and with him the formal machinery of investigation. But Miss Marple had already begun her own quiet inquiry, her mind cataloguing observations with the precision of a lifetime spent understanding the infinite varieties of human wickedness, all of which, she firmly believed, could be found in miniature within the confines of an English village. Inspector Slack emerged from his motor car with the air of a man determined to impose metropolitan efficiency upon rustic confusion. He was a thick-set individual with a perpetually suspicious expression, as though he expected every witness to be either lying or concealing something vital. In Miss Marple's experience, which included several previous encounters with the inspector, he was often correct in this assumption, though seldom able to discern precisely what was being concealed or by whom. Right then, he announced, surveying the assembled guests with evident disapproval. I understand we have a suspicious death. Dr. Haydock, if you'll show me the body, the rest of you will remain here under the supervision of Constable Polk. I'll want statements from everyone, and no one leaves until I say so. Constable Polk, a local man whose stolid demeanor concealed a sharp intelligence, took up position near the garden gate. Inspector Slack disappeared into the cottage with Dr. Haydock, leaving the guests to their increasingly anxious speculations. This is outrageous, Mrs. Price Ridley declared, though whether she referred to the murder or the inconvenience of being detained was unclear. I have dinner guests arriving at 7. Surely the inspector doesn't suspect respectable members of the community? Murder is rather indiscriminate in whom it involves, I'm afraid, Miss Marple observed gently. In my experience, respectability is often the most convenient disguise. Why, I remember a case in our village years ago, a most respected churchwarden, pillar of the community, who turned out to have poisoned 3 wives in succession for their insurance policies. Such a nice man, everyone said. Excellent tenor voice in the choir. This reminiscence did nothing to comfort Mrs. Price Ridley, who subsided into offended silence. Young Dennis Clement had moved away from the main group. standing alone near the rosemary bushes where his former friend, or had she been more than a friend, had presided over the tea service only hours earlier. Miss Marple observed that his hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, and that he cast frequent glances toward the cottage, as though expecting Mrs. Worthington to emerge at any moment and declare the entire affair a misunderstanding. Mr. Prescott had positioned himself strategically near the refreshment table, affecting an air of bored detachment that did not quite conceal the tension in his shoulders. He avoided eye contact with the other guests, particularly with Miss Marple, whose innocent observation about overhearing his conversation had placed him in a most uncomfortable position. It was Mrs. Clement who voiced what several others were thinking. "The tea," she said suddenly, her voice rising with agitation. "We all drank tea this afternoon. The same tea service, the same refreshments. How can we be certain that whatever killed poor Mrs. Worthington isn't affecting all of us?" This sparked immediate panic. Several guests began examining their own sensations with anxious attention, discovering all manner of suspicious symptoms that had likely existed unnoticed for years. Miss Hartnell announced she felt decidedly peculiar. Colonel Melchett admitted to a certain tightness in his chest, though this might have been attributed to the 3 cream cakes he had consumed. Dr. Haydock, emerging from the cottage to fetch his medical bag, overheard the commotion and raised a calming hand. "There's no cause for alarm. Whatever Mrs. Worthington ingested was in that cup alone, the one she prepared for herself in the kitchen. The tea service in the garden is perfectly safe. Inspector Slack has examined it thoroughly." "How can you be certain?" Mrs. Price Ridley demanded. "Because," Dr. Haydock replied patiently, "if the general tea service had been poisoned, we would have 40 corpses, not 1. Mrs. Worthington died from an acute dose of what I believe to be aconitine, the active poison in monkshood. The symptoms and the rapidity of death are characteristic. Such a dose in the general refreshments would have caused widespread casualties within minutes. No, this was targeted specifically at Mrs. Worthington, and the poison was administered in that private cup. Then someone entered the kitchen while she was occupied with guests," Colonel Melchett concluded, his military mind appreciating clear deductive chains. "Someone who knew she had a habit of preparing her own herbal teas. I recall she mentioned it during the afternoon. Said she suffered from digestive troubles and relied on her own remedies." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. See, this was indeed significant. Mrs. Worthington had mentioned her digestive complaints to several people, had even shown Mrs. Clement her collection of herbal remedy books just last week. The murderer had relied on this known habit, had counted on her preparing a private cup of tea in the kitchen where she kept her medicinal herbs. Inspector Slack reappeared, his expression even grimmer than before. "Right, I'll begin with those who had the closest connection to the deceased. Mr. Dennis Clement, you'll come with me first. I understand you were a frequent visitor to this cottage." Dennis's face flushed darkly. "I visited Mrs. Worthington socially, as did many people in the village. She was interested in literature, and I—" Yes. You can explain inside, and after you, I'll want Mr. Anthony Prescott. I understand you had words with the deceased shortly before her death." Mr. Prescott's urbane mask slipped further. "I had a brief conversation with an old acquaintance. Hardly a crime. We'll determine what's criminal and what isn't, sir. For now, I'll ask you both to keep yourselves available." As Dennis followed the inspector into the cottage, his shoulders hunched defensively, Miss Marple observed the reactions of those remaining. Mrs. Hargreaves wore an expression of grim satisfaction. She had provided valuable information, and knew it. Mr. Prescott's jaw was clenched tight, his earlier confidence eroding into something closer to fear. And there, at the edge of the garden, half hidden by the lavender hedge, stood a figure Miss Marple had not previously noticed with sufficient attention. Miss Lavinia Croft, the village librarian, a quiet woman in her 50s who rarely attended social functions. She was watching the cottage with an expression of such intensity that Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire into Miss Croft's connection to the deceased. The afternoon shadows had begun to lengthen across the herb garden, transforming the scene of earlier gaiety into something altogether more sinister. Miss Marple, still seated in her garden chair with her knitting, had positioned herself with the strategic advantage of being able to observe all the remaining guests while appearing to be merely a harmless elderly lady resting her feet. Dennis Clement emerged from the cottage after 20 minutes, his face pale and set. He walked directly past the assembled guests without a word, positioning himself at the furthest corner of the garden and lighting another cigarette with hands that still trembled noticeably. His aunt, Mrs. Clement, made as if to go to him, but the vicar laid a restraining hand on her arm and shook his head gently. "Mr. Prescott," Inspector Slack called from the doorway, his tone brooking no delay. As Mr. Prescott made his way toward the cottage, Miss Marple observed Miss Lavinia Croft step forward from her position by the lavender hedge. The librarian's normally placid features were animated with something that looked very much like determination. "Inspector," Miss Croft called out, her voice carrying a surprising authority. "Before you interview Mr. Prescott, there's something you should know. I saw him enter the kitchen earlier this afternoon, approximately 10 minutes before Mrs. Worthington was found. He was inside for several minutes, and when he emerged, he was adjusting his cuffs in the manner of someone who has been engaged in some hasty activity." The garden erupted into excited murmurs. Mr. Prescott stopped mid-stride, whirling to face his accuser. "That's a damned lie. I never went near that kitchen except when everyone else was crowded around after the body was discovered." "I'm afraid you did, Mr. Prescott," Miss Croft replied calmly, though 2 spots of color had appeared high on her cheekbones. "I was standing by the window. I'd gone inside to use the facilities, if you must know, and I saw you quite clearly through the hallway. You looked around to ensure no one was watching, then slipped into the kitchen. This was at approximately 4:15. I noted the time because I was concerned about catching my bus back to the village. I live just outside St. Mary Mead proper, you see." Inspector Slack's expression sharpened with interest. "Did you see what he did in the kitchen, Miss Croft?" "I could not see into the kitchen itself, only the hallway leading to it. But he was inside for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. When he emerged, he was wiping his hands on a handkerchief." "Wiping my hands because I'd washed them," Mr. Prescott snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's a sink in that kitchen, as I'm sure you've noticed, Inspector. After handling garden implements and eating sandwiches, I sought to freshen up. Is that now a crime?" "The facilities are in the opposite direction from the kitchen," Miss Croft pointed out with the precision of one accustomed to cataloguing and cross-referencing. "If hygiene was your concern, you passed a perfectly adequate washroom to reach the kitchen." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with thoughtful rhythm. This was most illuminating, though not necessarily in the way it appeared. Miss Croft's detailed observation raised questions of its own. Why had the librarian been watching the hallway so attentively? And why had she waited until now to reveal this crucial information rather than mentioning it immediately after the body was discovered? Inspector Slack gestured curtly. "Mr. Prescott, inside, now. Miss Croft, you'll wait here. I'll want a full statement from you after I've finished with Mr. Prescott." As the two disappeared into the cottage, Dr. Haydock moved to stand beside Miss Marple's chair. "Well, Jane," he murmured quietly, "this puts rather a different complexion on matters. If Prescott was in that kitchen alone shortly before Celia drank her tea, and if he knew about her habit of preparing herbal remedies for herself—" "If he knew," Miss Marple repeated softly. "That's rather the question, isn't it? Mr. Prescott arrived in St. Mary Mead only today. How would he have known about Mrs. Worthington's digestive complaints and her reliance on home-prepared tonics? Unless, of course, he knew her far better than he's admitting. You think they were more than mere acquaintances?" "I think, dear doctor, that there are several layers of untruth being presented to us. Mr. Prescott clearly recognized Mrs. Worthington immediately, or rather, recognized Cecily, as he called her. He knew about her past, about a transformation she had undergone. That suggests significant prior connection. Yet he claims to be merely an old acquaintance from London who happened to visit St. Mary Mead today of all days. Dr. Haydock frowned. You suspect he came here deliberately, that he sought her out? I think it very likely. The question is whether he came with murderous intent or whether circumstances developed unexpectedly. Miss Marple paused in her knitting, her faded blue eyes distant. There's another possibility, of course. Mr. Prescott may have entered the kitchen for innocent reasons, and someone else may be rather cleverly directing suspicion toward him. Miss Croft's testimony is very detailed, very damning, and very convenient. Lavinia Croft. Dr. Haydock looked startled. But she's the mildest creature imaginable. She's been village librarian for 20 years, never a word against anyone. Mild people can harbor strong feelings, Miss Marple observed. And in my experience, librarians are exceptionally skilled at research and acquiring information. If one wished to know how to extract aconitine from monkshood, for instance, a library would be an excellent place to begin. Before Dr. Haydock could respond, young Dennis Clement strode across the garden toward them, his earlier shock having transformed into something closer to anger. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, I need to speak with you both. The inspector has been asking the most extraordinary questions about my relationship with Mrs. Worthington. Now, he seems to think— Dennis's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. He seems to think I was in love with her, that I had expectations of marriage, and that she had recently rejected my advances. It's absurd. Is it absurd? Miss Marple asked gently. You were very attentive to her, dear boy. The village has talked of little else these past months. Dennis flushed. I admired her, certainly. She was cultured, intelligent, interested in the same literature I care about. But marriage? She was 15 years my senior, and besides— He stopped abruptly, as though on the verge of revealing something he'd rather keep concealed. Besides what, Dennis? Dr. Haydock prompted. The young man's jaw worked. Besides, she was already being courted by someone else. This revelation sent a ripple of shock through those near enough to overhear. Mrs. St. Clement gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Even Colonel Melchett, who had been discussing cricket scores with the vicar in an attempt to maintain normalcy, turned sharply. Courted? Miss Hartnell's voice carried across the garden with unfortunate clarity. Mrs. Worthington was being courted? By whom? Why has no one mentioned this before? Dennis looked as though he regretted his words immediately, but there was no retrieving them now. He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it further. I don't know his name. She was very discreet about it. But over the past month she received regular letters, always in the same hand, always marked personal. And twice I called at the cottage unexpectedly and found her hurriedly ending telephone conversations. When I asked if anything was wrong, she became evasive. I said it was a private matter from her London life. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. These letters, Dennis. Did you happen to notice the postmark? London, always London. He fumbled for another cigarette, his fingers clumsy with agitation. I know what you're all thinking, that I was jealous, that I resented this mysterious rival, but I swear to you, whatever affection I felt for Mrs. Worthington was nothing that would lead to murder. Good God, the very idea is monstrous. No one is accusing you, dear boy, Dr. Haydock said, though his tone lacked complete conviction. But you must see how it appears. You were close to the deceased, you had access to her kitchen and knew her habits, and now we learn there was emotional complication. Which gives Mr. Prescott an equally strong motive, Dennis interrupted sharply. He clearly had some prior connection to her, something significant enough to cause her distress at his arrival. Perhaps he was the mysterious correspondent. Perhaps he came here today because she'd rebuffed him, and he killed her in revenge. It was plausible, Miss Marple acknowledged silently. Yet something about the theory didn't quite satisfy. Mr. Prescott had appeared genuinely surprised to find Mrs. Worthington, or Cecily, in St. Mary, Mead. His shock had seemed authentic, not the reaction of a rejected suitor who had tracked down his quarry. Unless, of course, he was an exceptionally skilled actor. Mrs. Hargreaves, emboldened by the general atmosphere of revelation, spoke up again. If we're discussing Mrs. Worthington's personal affairs, I should mention that she received a visitor 3 nights ago, a gentleman, though I couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness. He arrived after 10 o'clock and stayed until nearly midnight. I heard their voices, raised voices, through the wall. Mrs. Worthington was angry, I'm certain of that. She kept saying, "Absolutely not," and "You have no right." "And you didn't think to mention this immediately?" Colonel Melchett demanded, his military bearing asserting itself. "A mysterious late-night visitor, an argument. This is vital information, madam." Mrs. Hargreaves bristled defensively. "I'm mentioning it now, aren't I? And how was I to know it was connected to her death? People do receive visitors, even late at night. It wasn't until all this business with Mr. Prescott and the letters that I realized it might be significant." "Did you see this visitor leave?" Miss Marple asked, her tone remaining gentle where the Colonel's had been harsh. "Did you observe his manner of departure?" "I heard the door close and saw a figure walking quickly down the lane toward the village. He had a hat pulled low and kept to the shadows, as though he didn't wish to be recognized. I remember thinking it odd at the time, almost furtive." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the same care she applied to every stitch in her knitting. A mysterious London correspondent, a late-night visitor who wished to remain unobserved, Mr. Prescott's unexpected arrival and recognition of Cecily, and now a murder accomplished with knowledge of both toxic plants and Mrs. Worthington's habits. The elements were there, certainly, but they had not yet arranged themselves into a coherent pattern. Inspector Slack emerged from the cottage, his expression thunderous. "Miss Croft, if you'll come with me now, and I'll want Mrs. Hargreaves after that. Seems everyone has been sitting on crucial information while I've been wasting time." As the librarian followed the inspector inside, Miss Marple noticed something she had observed before but not given sufficient weight. Miss Croft walked with a slight limp, favoring her left leg. It was not pronounced, merely a subtle unevenness in her gait. And 3 nights ago, Mrs. Hargreaves had reported seeing a figure, referred to as he, departing from the cottage. But in darkness, with a hat pulled low, might one not mistake a woman for a man, particularly a tall woman like Miss Croft, yet who stood nearly 5 feet 9 inches? "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said quietly, drawing the physician aside. "How well do you know Miss Croft? Has she been in the village all her life?" "Lavinia? Good Lord, no. She came here about 20 years ago, took the librarian position after old Miss Trimble retired. Before that, I believe she was in London, worked in one of the university libraries, if memory serves. Why do you ask?" "London?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How interesting. And tell me, has she ever shown particular interest in herbalism or botany?" Dr. Haydock considered this. "Now that you mention it, yes. She's quite knowledgeable about medicinal plants. The library has an extensive collection on the subject, and Lavinia has often recommended books on herbs to village residents. In fact, I believe she and Mrs. Worthington had discussed the topic on several occasions. Mrs. Worthington mentioned once that Miss Croft had suggested several useful references for her garden planning." "I see," Miss Marple said softly. "How very helpful of her, and how very convenient that she happened to observe Mr. Prescott entering the kitchen at such a crucial time." Dr. Haydock's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "Jane, surely you're not suggesting—" But whatever Miss Marple might have suggested was interrupted by a commotion from inside the cottage. There was the sound of raised voices, a crash of something breaking, and then Mr. Prescott burst through the doorway, his face contorted with fury, closely followed by Inspector Slack. "This is a conspiracy," Mr. Prescott shouted, his carefully maintained composure shattered entirely. "That woman is lying through her teeth, and I demand to know why she's attempting to frame me for a murder I didn't commit." Inspector Slack's face had gone an alarming shade of purple. "Control yourself, sir, or I'll have you taken into custody for obstruction. Miss Croft has provided a clear and consistent statement of what she observed. If you have an alternate explanation for your presence in that kitchen, now is the time to offer it." "I've told you my explanation. I wash my hands. That's all." Mr. Prescott's voice had risen to a pitch that suggested either genuine panic or a calculated display of outraged innocence. I had no idea where Mrs. Worthington kept her medicinal herbs. I had no knowledge of aconitine or any other poison. And I had absolutely no reason to wish her dead. "Yet you knew her as Cecily," Miss Marple observed from her chair, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "You knew she had transformed herself, that she was, as you put it, wearing a costume. That suggests intimate knowledge of her past, Mr. Prescott. The sort of knowledge that might provide ample motive for murder if that past contained secrets she wished to keep buried." Mr. Prescott's gaze swung toward her, wild and desperate. "You don't understand. Yes, I knew Cecily, Celia, from before. But I had no intention of exposing her secrets. I was merely surprised to find her here, playing at being a respectable country widow." "Playing at it?" Mrs. Price Ridley echoed indignantly. "What do you mean by that, sir? Are you suggesting Mrs. Worthington was an impostor?" For a long moment, Mr. Prescott seemed to struggle with himself, weighing the dangers of revelation against the dangers of continued concealment. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Her name wasn't Worthington. Her husband's name was Wallace, Henry Wallace. He dealt in pharmaceutical imports, not tea. And when he died 5 years ago in Mumbai, it wasn't from heart trouble. He was murdered." The garden erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped in shock and excitement. Questions flew from all directions, and Inspector Slack had to bellow for silence before order could be restored. "Murdered?" the inspector repeated, his notebook now poised with keen interest. "And how do you come to know this, Mr. Prescott?" "Because I was his business partner," Mr. Prescott said wearily, and all pretense of urbanity stripped away. "Henry and I ran the pharmaceutical import business together. We were in Mumbai when he died, poisoned at a dinner party. The local police investigated, but they never determined who was responsible. There were several suspects, business rivals, a disgruntled employee, even Cecily herself. She inherited everything, you see. A considerable fortune." "Good heavens," breathed Mrs. Clement, "and she came here to hide from the investigation." "There was no formal investigation in England," Mr. Prescott replied. "The death occurred in India, and while suspicious, it couldn't be proven as murder. But there were rumors, whispers in our business circles. Celia, sold the company, changed her name slightly, and disappeared. I lost track of her until today." Miss Marple's needles had resumed their steady rhythm. "Yet you recognized her immediately, Mr. Prescott, and she recognized you. One might almost think you had been searching for her." "I wasn't searching for anyone," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I came to St. Mary Mead at Dr. Haydock's invitation. Pure coincidence." Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably. "That's true, Inspector. Anthony wrote to me last month asking if he might visit. I'd mentioned St. Mary Mead in previous correspondence, described it as a peaceful village where he might rest and recover from some business troubles in London. I had no idea he had any connection to Mrs. Worthington." "How convenient," Inspector Slack said dryly. "And these business troubles in London, might they be connected to the pharmaceutical trade?" "To matters involving poisons, perhaps." Before Mr. Prescott could respond, Miss Croft reappeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "Inspector, I've remembered something else. That book that was open on Mrs. Worthington's kitchen table, the herbal remedy book. I saw it earlier in the day when I borrowed it from her. She was looking for remedies for anxiety and sleeplessness. She'd been quite distressed recently, she told me, afraid of something from her past catching up with her." "When did she tell you this?" Miss Marple asked sharply. Yesterday, when I visited to return a book she'd lent me. We spoke for nearly an hour. She was quite agitated, kept looking out the window as though she expected someone. I asked if I could help, but she said it was an old matter, something she thought she'd left behind years ago. She said, Miss Croft's voice dropped. She said, the past never stays buried as deeply as we hope, Lavinia. Sooner or later, the dead rise up to accuse us. The dramatic quality of this statement seemed almost theatrical, and Miss Marple found herself studying the librarian with renewed interest. Miss Croft stood with remarkable stillness, her hands folded at her waist, her expression appropriately somber. Yet there was something practiced about her demeanor, as though she were an actress who had rehearsed her role thoroughly. "Did she mention any names?" Inspector Slack demanded. "Give any indication of who or what she feared?" "No names, but she did say something odd. She said, 'Knowledge is the most dangerous weapon, don't you think, Lavinia? More dangerous than any knife or gun. Once someone knows your secrets, you're never truly free.'" Dennis Clement, who had been listening with growing agitation, suddenly spoke up. "She said almost the same thing to me last week. She said that secrets had a way of festering, that keeping them was like harboring poison in one's own body." Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely, her full attention now focused on this convergence of similar statements. Mrs. Worthington had been preoccupied with secrets, with knowledge as a weapon, with the past rising to accuse. She had made these observations to multiple people, almost as though she were preparing them for some revelation or perhaps warning them. The evening light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the herb garden that now seemed less charming than ominous. Inspector Slack, recognizing that darkness would soon make outdoor interviews impractical, had commandeered the cottage's sitting room for continued questioning. The remaining guests huddled in small groups, their earlier excitement giving way to fatigue and unease. Miss Marple had observed something curious during the past hour. The way people positioned themselves revealed unexpected alliances and anxieties. Dennis Clement had drawn close to his aunt and uncle, seeking familial protection. Mrs. Hargreaves stood with Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley, the three women forming a defensive cluster of respectable outrage. Dr. Haydock remained somewhat isolated, his professional obligations separating him from social comfort. And Mr. Prescott had retreated to the far corner of the garden and was smoking cigarette after cigarette with the air of a man whose careful plans had collapsed entirely. But it was Miss Croft who drew Miss Marple's most careful attention. The librarian had positioned herself near the kitchen door, ostensibly at Inspector Slack's request to remain available for further questions. Yet her gaze kept drifting to the herb garden itself, particularly to the section where the monkshood grew in its deadly profusion. Once, Miss Marple observed her take several steps toward those purple blooms before catching herself and returning to her post. "Penny for your thoughts, Jane," Dr. Haydock murmured, having drifted back to her side. "I was thinking," Miss Marple replied softly, "about the nature of knowledge. Miss Croft made a most interesting observation earlier. That knowledge is the most dangerous weapon. And it occurs to me that a librarian is uniquely positioned to acquire dangerous knowledge without arousing suspicion. Research into poisons, for instance, or investigation into someone's hidden past." Dr. Haydock frowned. "You believe Lavinia is involved in this business, but she's the one who provided evidence against Prescott." "Precisely. She was very quick to direct suspicion toward Mr. Prescott, wasn't she? Almost as though she wished to ensure the inspector looked in that direction, and no other." Miss Marple paused. "Tell me, Doctor, in your medical opinion, how long would it take for a conatine poisoning to manifest symptoms?" "Quite rapidly. Within minutes of ingestion, one would experience burning sensations in the mouth and throat, followed by numbness, difficulty breathing, and cardiac irregularities. And death can occur within an hour, sometimes much faster, depending on the dose. And Mrs. Worthington was found at approximately 4:30. Miss Croft claims to have seen Mr. Prescott in the kitchen at 4:15. That would be adequate time for him to have poisoned the tea, assuming it was already prepared and waiting. But Mrs. Worthington made a great show of preparing fresh teas throughout the afternoon. I observed her doing so several times. She was most particular about steeping times and temperature. Would she have prepared a cup for herself and then left it sitting in the kitchen for 15 minutes or more while she attended to guests? Dr. Haydock's eyes sharpened. You're suggesting the tea was prepared closer to the time of death, perhaps only 5 or 10 minutes before she drank it. Which would mean Mr. Prescott could not have been the one to poison it, despite Miss Croft's testimony about seeing him in the kitchen at 4:15. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her needles moving with thoughtful precision. Unless, of course, Miss Croft is mistaken about the time, or lying about it. Before Dr. Haydock could respond, Constable Polk approached them with a respectful nod. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but the inspector would like a word with you now. He's finishing up with Mr. Clement." Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful movements of one who had been seated too long. As she made her way toward the cottage, she observed Dennis emerging, his face haggard. The young man's eyes met hers briefly, and she read in them a desperate plea for understanding or perhaps absolution. And Inspector Slack's temporary office, formerly Mrs. Worthington's tastefully appointed sitting room, bore evidence of thorough investigation. Papers were spread across the writing desk, drawers had been opened and examined, and a small collection of items sat on a side table, several letters, a ledger book, and what appeared to be a photograph in a silver frame. Face down. Miss Marple. Inspector Slack greeted her with the wary respect of one who had learned through painful experience not to dismiss elderly village ladies as irrelevant witnesses. "I understand you overheard a conversation between the deceased and Mr. Prescott earlier this afternoon." "Indeed, Inspector. I was examining the foxgloves, such magnificent specimens, when I happened to hear voices on the other side of the hedge." Miss Marple recounted the conversation faithfully, and watching Inspector Slack's face grow increasingly intent as she described Mr. Prescott's reference to Cecily and his suggestion that Mrs. Worthington was wearing a costume, playing a role. "And you're certain of the words used?" the inspector pressed. "He definitely suggested she had transformed herself." "Quite certain. He said, 'People are never truly someone else. They simply wear better costumes.' And Mrs. Worthington responded that her old life was finished, that she was someone else now." Inspector Slack made a note, then fixed her with a calculating gaze. "In your observation, Miss Marple, did Mrs. Worthington seem frightened of Mr. Prescott specifically, or was her fear more general?" It was a perceptive question, and Miss Marple gave it due consideration. She was disturbed by his presence, certainly. Alarmed, even, but I would characterize her emotion as anger as much as fear. She was adamant that he leave St. Mary Mead immediately. Whether she feared him personally or feared what his presence might reveal, I cannot say with certainty. And what about the others? Young Clement, for instance. How would you characterize his relationship with the deceased? Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "Dennis is a romantic young man with literary inclinations. Mrs. Worthington represented sophistication and culture, qualities not abundant in St. Mary Mead. I believe he was infatuated with her, though whether she encouraged this attachment is unclear. He claims she was being courted by someone else. Do you have any knowledge of this?" "None whatsoever, though I would note that Mrs. Hargreaves reported a late-night visitor 3 nights ago. Perhaps that is connected to Dennis's assertion." Inspector Slack grunted, making another note. "And Miss Croft? What's your impression of her involvement?" Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "I find it curious, Inspector, that Miss Croft happened to observe Mr. Prescott in the kitchen at such a convenient time. I also find it interesting that she has been so forthcoming with information about Mrs. Worthington's state of mind and statements regarding secrets in the past. One might almost think she wishes to construct a particular narrative." Inspector Slack leaned back in his chair, studying Miss Marple with the expression of a man revising his assumptions. "You suspect Miss Croft of manufacturing evidence? That's a serious allegation." "I suspect nothing definitively, Inspector. I merely observe inconsistencies." Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her eyes were sharp. "Miss Croft has provided a great deal of information, all of it painting either Mr. Prescott or, indirectly, young Dennis as the obvious suspects. Yet her own connection to Mrs. Worthington seems worthy of examination. They discussed herbs frequently, I understand. Miss Croft would have known precisely which plants were toxic and how they might be prepared." "Half the village knew Mrs. Worthington's interest in herbs," the inspector countered. "That's hardly evidence." "True, but how many possessed both the knowledge to extract aconitine and a reason to wish Mrs. Worthington dead?" Miss Marple paused, then added delicately, "You've examined her personal papers, Inspector. Have you found anything that might illuminate her relationship with Miss Croft?" Inspector Slack's hesitation told her she had struck upon something significant. He shuffled through the papers on the desk before extracting a letter. "This arrived 2 weeks ago. It's unsigned, but the handwriting matches several other letters we found in Mrs. Worthington's correspondence." He handed the letter to Miss Marple, who read it with careful attention. "Your secrets are not as secure as you imagine. I have discovered the truth about Mumbai, about Henry, and about what you did to acquire your comfortable existence. You will pay for your crimes, if not in a court of law, then by other means. Justice will be served." The script was educated, precise, the writing of someone accustomed to handling documents and forming letters with care. Now Miss Marple held the paper up to the fading light, noting the quality of the stationery. Standard writing paper, the sort that might be purchased at any village shop. "This is a blackmail letter," she observed. "Or rather, a threat of exposure. The writer claims knowledge of Mrs. Worthington's past and suggests consequences. Have you found evidence that money was demanded?" "Not in so many words, but we found this as well." Inspector Slack produced a draft letter in Mrs. Worthington's hand, dated 3 days prior. "I will not submit to your demands. What happened in Mumbai was not my doing, and you know it. Your interference in my life here is unconscionable. If you persist, I shall be forced to reveal certain facts about your own past that you might prefer remain hidden. I too can play at this game of exposure." Miss Marple absorbed this with keen interest. So Mrs. Worthington was not a passive victim of blackmail. She possessed information about her tormentor as well. This suggests they shared a common history, perhaps in Mumbai or London. "Or right here in St. Mary Mead," Inspector Slack added grimly. "Miss Croft lived in London 20 years ago, as did Mr. Prescott. Both could have known the Wallaces during their pharmaceutical business days. And Dennis Clement. Young Clement was at university during the relevant period. We're checking his background now, but he seems an unlikely connection to Mumbai or the pharmaceutical trade." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where the remaining guests still waited in the gathering dusk. "Inspector, may I ask what you found regarding the actual poison?" Dr. Haydock mentioned monkshood was present on the kitchen work table. "Fresh cuttings, yes. But here's the interesting part. Monkshood takes considerable preparation to extract a fatal dose of aconitine. You can't simply steep the leaves like tea and expect results. The roots contain the highest concentration of poison, and even then, it requires knowledge of extraction methods." He paused significantly. "We found a small vial in the kitchen cupboard, hidden behind the flour canister. It contained a concentrated liquid. I'm having it analyzed, but Dr. Haydock believes it's aconitine extract." "Someone prepared it in advance," Miss Marple said quietly. "This was not an impulsive crime committed in the heat of passion. The murderer came to this garden party with poison already prepared, through knowing Mrs. Worthington's habit of making herself herbal remedies, knowing precisely when and how to administer a fatal dose. That's my conclusion as well. Which brings us back to opportunity. Who had access to that kitchen during the crucial period? Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. Anyone could have slipped inside while Mrs. Worthington was occupied with guests. The kitchen door was open all afternoon, but the murderer needed to know when Mrs. Worthington would prepare her tea. That requires either intimate knowledge of her habits or careful observation, or coordination with the victim herself. Inspector Slack suggested. What if someone arranged to meet her in the kitchen? What if Mrs. Worthington prepared that tea expecting to share it with someone? It was an intriguing possibility. Miss Marple considered it carefully, mentally reviewing the afternoon's events. Mrs. Worthington had been attentive to her duties as hostess throughout the tea, but had she seemed distracted, watchful? Yes, particularly after Mr. Prescott's arrival. But also before, as though she had been expecting something or someone. "The photograph," Miss Marple said suddenly, gesturing to the silver frame lying face down on the side table. "May I?" Inspector Slack nodded, and Miss Marple picked up the frame. The photograph showed a group of 4 people at what appeared to be a formal dinner. A handsome man in his 50s who must have been Henry Wallace, Mrs. Worthington looking younger and softer than the woman Miss Marple had known, and 2 others, a woman and a man. The woman was tall, perhaps 40 at the time the photograph was taken, with strong features and an intelligent gaze. The man was younger, fair-haired, unmistakably Mr. Prescott, but it was the woman who held Miss Marple's attention. Even 20 years younger and dressed for an elegant occasion rather than in the sensible clothes of a village librarian, those features were recognizable. "That's Miss Croft," she said quietly. "This photograph places her in Mumbai with the Wallaces and Mr. Prescott. They all knew each other." Inspector Slack's face registered grim satisfaction. "Then we have our connection. Miss Croft wasn't simply a village librarian who happened to befriend Mrs. Worthington. She knew exactly who she was dealing with from the beginning." "The question remains," Miss Marple observed, "whether that knowledge led to blackmail, to murder, or to something else entirely." A commotion outside drew their attention. Constable Polk's voice rose in alarm, followed by the sound of running feet. Inspector Slack rushed to the door with Miss Marple close behind. In the garden, illuminated by the cottage's exterior lights, stood Miss Croft. She held something in her hand, a small vial identical to the one found in the kitchen. Her face was deathly pale but composed, resolved. "I think," she said clearly, addressing the assembled witnesses, "that it's time for the truth to be told." The garden fell into profound silence, every eye fixed on Miss Lavinia Croft as she stood illuminated in the cottage lights like an actress on a stage. Even the evening birds seemed to have ceased their calling as though nature itself waited for her revelation. 22 years ago, Miss Croft began, so her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was employed as a research librarian at the Pharmaceutical College in London. That's where I met Henry Wallace and his business partner, Anthony Prescott. They were developing a new line of medicinal extracts from Indian plants, and they hired me to conduct historical research on traditional remedies." Mr. Prescott, still standing in the far corner of the garden, made a sound that might have been protest or acknowledgement. Miss Croft ignored him and continued. "Henry was brilliant, charming, and thoroughly unscrupulous. He asked me to marry him, and fool that I was, I accepted. But before we could wed, he traveled to Mumbai on business and returned married to someone else, the woman you knew as Celia Worthington. He'd met Cecily Drake in a Bombay hotel. She was a typist, pretty and ambitious, and she'd decided Henry was her ticket to a better life." Mrs. Clement made a small sound of sympathy, but Miss Croft's expression remained hard, unyielding. "I was devastated, naturally. But I continued my work for the company. Over the years, I watched Cecily manipulate Henry, spend his money lavishly, and engage in affairs she barely bothered to conceal. I knew things about her, indiscretions, lies she told Henry about her background, even evidence of a previous marriage she'd never disclosed. Knowledge, as I told her yesterday, is indeed a dangerous weapon. You blackmailed her, Inspector Slack stated flatly. No. Miss Croft's denial was sharp. I'd never demanded money. What I wanted was far simpler. I wanted her to suffer as I had suffered. When Henry died in Mumbai, poisoned at that dinner party, I knew Cecily was responsible. I couldn't prove it. The Indian police couldn't prove it, but I knew. She'd grown tired of Henry, wanted his money without the inconvenience of his presence. She used her knowledge of our research, the very information I'd helped compile, to poison him with aconitine. It's nearly undetectable in routine post-mortem examinations, especially in a country where investigative resources are limited. That's a lie, Mr. Prescott shouted, striding forward. Henry's death was investigated thoroughly. No evidence of foul play was ever established. Because Cecily was clever, Miss Croft replied coldly. She administered the poison gradually over several days, small doses that mimicked the symptoms of tropical fever. By the time Henry died, his system was so compromised that death appeared natural. But I knew. I'd helped research those very extraction methods. Miss Marple, observing from the cottage doorway, noted how Miss Croft's narrative had captured everyone's attention, perhaps too effectively. The librarian spoke with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed this speech, refined it, prepared for this moment of revelation. When I learned that Cecily had reinvented herself as the respectable widow Worthington and settled in St. Mary Mead, Miss Croft continued, I applied for the librarian position here. It took me 2 years to be appointed, but I was patient. I watched her build her new life, her garden, her reputation, and then, 3 weeks ago, I finally confronted her with what I knew. You sent the threatening letters, Inspector Slack interjected. I wanted her to suffer from fear as I had suffered from betrayal. And I wanted her to know that her past had caught up with her, that she would never be free of what she'd done. Miss Croft's voice had risen, emotion finally cracking through her composed exterior. But I swear to you, Inspector, I did not kill her. I wanted her to live with her guilt, to look over her shoulder forever. Death would have been too merciful. Then why, Miss Marple asked gently, stepping forward, are you holding that vial of poison in your hand? Miss Croft looked down at the small bottle as though surprised to find it there. I found it, just now, while everyone was distracted by the inspector's interviews. It was hidden in the garden, buried beneath the monkshood plants. Someone placed it there after the murder, trying to conceal evidence. Or you're attempting to dispose of it now, Inspector Slack suggested, having realized we'd found the matching vial in the kitchen. No, I tell you, I found it just moments ago. Someone else prepared this poison. Someone else murdered Cecily. Miss Croft's composure was fracturing visibly now, her face flushed, her breathing rapid. Don't you see? I've given you the truth about Mumbai, about Henry's murder, about my relationship with the Wallaces. Why would I confess all of that if I were guilty of this crime? It was a valid question, Miss Marple acknowledged silently. Miss Croft's revelations had established powerful motives: revenge for stolen love, justice for an unpunished murder. Yet something about the librarian's performance, and it was a performance, Miss Marple was now certain, felt calculated rather than spontaneous. Because, Miss Marple said quietly, drawing every eye toward her, you wish to establish a narrative in which you were the wronged party, the victim of Cecily's machinations. You've painted yourself as someone who wanted prolonged suffering for Mrs. Worthington, not quick death. But I'm afraid, Miss Croft, that your story contains several significant flaws. Miss Croft's face went rigid. What flaws? Everything I've told you is the truth. Oh, I don't doubt the essential facts, Miss Marple replied, moving closer with her gentle, implacable manner. The betrayal, the suspicions about Henry Wallace's death, your long-harbored resentment, all quite true, I'm sure. But your account of today's events, particularly your observation of Mr. Prescott in the kitchen, that, I fear, was entirely fabricated. That's absurd. I saw him. No, my dear, Miss Marple interrupted softly. B, you saw what you wished others to believe you saw, but I'm afraid the timing doesn't work at all. Inspector Slack's hand moved instinctively toward Miss Croft, but Miss Marple raised a gentle, restraining gesture. If you'll permit me, Inspector, I believe I can demonstrate the inconsistencies. She turned her attention back to Miss Croft, whose face had become a mask of rigid control. You claim to have seen Mr. Prescott enter the kitchen at 4:15, having gone inside to use the facilities. But you see, I happened to observe you throughout the afternoon, Miss Croft. You never went inside the cottage until after Mrs. Worthington's body was discovered. You remained in the garden the entire time, standing by the lavender hedge near the back gate. I noticed you particularly because you seemed to be watching Mrs. S. Worthington very intently. You're mistaken, Miss Croft said, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. I went inside briefly. I'm afraid Miss Marple is quite right, Mrs. Clement interjected tremulously. I remember noticing Miss Croft by the hedge because I thought how unusual it was to see her at a social gathering. She so rarely attends village events. She was there for at least an hour, and I don't recall her going inside at all. Miss Croft's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued in her mild, inexorable manner. Moreover, your account of the late-night visitor 3 nights ago, the one Mrs. Hargreaves reported, was meant to suggest a mysterious third party. But I believe that visitor was you, Miss Croft. Mrs. Hargreaves described someone walking with a furtive manner, keeping to shadows. You walk with a slight limp, favoring your left leg. In darkness, with a hat pulled low, you might easily have been mistaken for a man. This is pure speculation, Miss Croft protested, but her knuckles had gone white around the vial she still clutched. Is it? You've admitted to confronting Mrs. Worthington 3 weeks ago. You've admitted to sending threatening letters. Why should we doubt that you also visited her late at night to continue your campaign of intimidation? Miss Marple paused, her faded blue eyes sharp with understanding. But something went wrong during that visit, didn't it? Mrs. Worthington didn't cower or beg for mercy as you'd hoped. Instead, she threatened you. She had nothing on me, Miss Croft said, but her voice cracked. Oh, but she did. You said it yourself. She'd spent years in Henry Wallace's company, the years in which she would have observed the business and its personnel. She knew about your research into toxic extracts. She knew you had both knowledge and means to commit murder, and she possessed something even more damning. Miss Marple gestured toward the cottage. That photograph we found in her sitting room. Inspector Slack's expression sharpened with understanding. The photograph from Mumbai. It places Miss Croft with the Wallaces. Indeed, but more than that. It places her there at the dinner party where Henry Wallace died. Mrs. Worthington kept that photograph for 5 years, through her transformation, her move to England, her reinvention. Why? Unless it served as insurance, evidence that another person present that night had equal knowledge of poisons and equal opportunity to commit murder. Miss Croft's composure shattered completely. She was going to blame me for Henry's death, after everything she'd done, after she'd stolen him from me and then killed him. She was going to turn it all around and accuse me. That night, 3 days ago, she showed me copies of letters she'd prepared. To the police, to Anthony, to my employers at the library, claiming that I had poisoned Henry out of jealous revenge, and that she'd kept silent out of fear for her own safety. She said if I didn't stop my letters and leave her alone, she'd destroy me. The words tumbled out now, rapid and desperate. The assembled witnesses stood transfixed, nears watching 20 years of buried rage and pain erupt into the twilight garden. So you decided to act first? Miss Marple said gently. You couldn't risk her exposing you, couldn't bear the thought of her living in comfort and respectability while you were branded a murderer. You'd spent months learning her habits, her routines. You knew she prepared medicinal teas for herself. You'd helped her select books on herbal remedies, had even suggested useful references, all while planning exactly how you would poison her with her own beloved plants. She deserved it, Miss Croft whispered. After what she did to Henry, after she destroyed my life. Did she poison Henry? Miss Marple interrupted. Or did you? You've spent so long constructing this narrative of Cecily as the villainous murderess that perhaps you've come to believe it yourself. But I wonder, Miss Croft, whether your real crime wasn't murdering Mrs. Worthington this afternoon, but murdering Henry Wallace 5 years ago when you realized he would never be yours. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Miss Croft stared at Miss Marple, her mouth working soundlessly. Around them, the other witnesses seemed frozen, barely breathing. I loved Henry, Miss Croft finally said, her voice barely audible. Everything I did because I loved him. And that, Miss Marple replied sadly, is perhaps the most dangerous motivation of all. Love, when it curdles into obsession and revenge, becomes indistinguishable from hatred. Inspector Slack moved forward then, taking the vial from Miss Croft's unresisting fingers. Lavinia Croft, I'm arresting you for the murder of Celia Worthington. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. Miss Croft offered no resistance as Constable Peck gently took her arm. She looked suddenly smaller, older, as though the weight of her confession had physically diminished her. As Constable Polk led Miss Croft toward the waiting police vehicle, she paused and turned back to face the assembled witnesses. Her expression had transformed from defiance to something approaching relief, as though the burden of years of deception had finally been lifted. You were right about one thing, Miss Marple, she said quietly. I did poison Henry Wallace in Mumbai. Not Cecily. She was faithless and mercenary, yes, but she wasn't a murderess. I was. Mr. Prescott made a strangled sound of shock. But why, Lavinia? And if you loved him? Because he humiliated me, Miss Croft replied, her voice hollow. He paraded his new bride in front of me, expected me to continue working for the company as though nothing had happened, as though my heart hadn't been shattered. At that dinner party, I saw my opportunity. I'd spent months researching aconitine for our pharmaceutical work. I knew exactly how to administer it so that death would appear natural. I put it in his wine during the confusion of the courses being served. She drew a shuddering breath. Cecily suspected, I think. She watched me that night with those clever eyes of hers. After Henry died, she said nothing to the authorities, but she kept that photograph, kept evidence that I'd been there. For 5 years, I believed I was safe, that she'd taken her inheritance and disappeared. But then I learned she was here, in this quiet village, living the peaceful life I should have had. So you followed her, Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. I spent 2 years securing the librarian position, 2 years of patience, of planning. I thought I wanted her to suffer through fear, through the slow erosion of her carefully constructed new life. But when she threatened to expose me 3 nights ago, I knew there was only one solution. She had to die, and she had to die in a way that would point to someone else, Mr. Prescott or young Dennis, or even to suggest she'd accidentally poisoned herself. Dennis Clement, who had been listening with growing horror, found his voice. The things you told me about her, the suggestions that she had secrets, that she feared something from her past. You were building a case against her even as you planned her murder. I needed witnesses to her distress, to her fear. I needed the village to believe she was being threatened by someone from London, that her death resulted from old scandals catching up with her. Miss Croft's voice carried a note of bitter pride. It nearly worked. If Miss Marple hadn't been quite so observant about where I spent the afternoon, if she hadn't noticed that I never actually went inside to witness Mr. Prescott in the kitchen. But she did notice, Inspector Slack interrupted firmly. And now you'll answer for 2 murders, not 1. Come along. As the police vehicle departed with Miss Croft inside, the remaining witnesses stood in stunned silence. The spring evening, which had begun with such cheerful promise at the charity tea, had darkened into something far more sinister. The herb garden, so lovingly tended by Mrs. Worthington, seemed to have lost its charm entirely, the shadows between the plants now suggesting concealment rather than tranquility. Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple, shaking his head in wonder. "Jane, how did you know? When did you first suspect Miss Croft?" "Several small things accumulated," Miss Marple replied, gathering her knitting. Her detailed observations of Mrs. Worthington's behavior, which suggested long-term watching rather than casual acquaintance. Her immediate willingness to provide damning testimony against Mr. Prescott. Most significantly, her claim to have seen him in the kitchen when I knew she'd been in the garden the entire time. Once I realized she'd fabricated that evidence, I had to ask myself why. The answer, of course, was that she needed to direct suspicion elsewhere because she herself was guilty. Mr. Prescott, who had remained silent during Miss Croft's confession, stepped forward. His urbanity had been stripped away entirely, leaving him looking exhausted and rather lost. "I owe you an apology, Miss Marple. All of you, really. I should have been forthcoming about my connection to Celia from the beginning. My arrival today was not entirely coincidental. I'd learned she was living here and wanted to discuss old business matters, financial loose ends from our partnership. I never imagined—" He broke off, unable to continue. "None of us imagined," the vicar said gently. "That's the terrible thing about such crimes. They occur in places and among people we believe to be safe and familiar." Mrs. Clement had begun to cry again, this time with a deeper grief. Poor Mrs. Worthington. Whatever her faults, she didn't deserve to die like that, and to think Miss Croft sat in our library all these years, helping children select books, recommending novels to the ladies' reading circle, all while carrying such hatred in her heart. "Hatred and grief are close cousins," Miss Marple observed. Miss Croft loved Henry Wallace with an intensity that couldn't survive betrayal. When that love was rejected, it transformed into something poisonous, quite literally. She spent 5 years believing she'd escaped justice for his murder, only to discover that her victim's widow possessed evidence that could destroy her. At that point, a second murder must have seemed the only solution. Colonel Melchett, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the evening's revelations, cleared his throat gruffly. "What I don't understand is how you knew Miss Croft was lying about being inside the cottage, Miss Marple. Surely you couldn't have watched everyone continuously throughout the afternoon." "Not continuously, no," Miss Marple admitted. "But I have a particular habit of observing people at social gatherings. It comes from years of village life, I suppose. One learns to notice who stands where, who speaks to whom, who appears uncomfortable or watchful. Miss Croft was memorable precisely because she seemed so intent on remaining unnoticed while simultaneously watching Mrs. Worthington with fixed attention. That sort of concentrated observation leaves an impression.